Hello. So for this video for Black History Month, we're going to be talking about Derek Walcott's play Pantomime. I do want to apologize right at the beginning. I have my seemingly now annual cold. So hopefully I will not sound too gross in this video. So I've read a Derek Walcott play before, Dream on Monkey Mountain, which I thought was alright. It was not my favorite thing that I'd ever read. I liked Pantomime so much more. And partially that has to do, I think, with this play is more of a realist drama, whereas Dream on Monkey Mountain is, as the title suggests, a dream play, and that's not really what I'm that into. So Pantomime definitely was on a dramaturgical level much more my speed. But the other thing is, this is a really, really fascinating example of post-colonial drama working through some of the biggest theoretical issues of post-colonialism. So the play features two characters: Harry True, described as English, mid-40s, owner of the Castaways Guest House, retired actor, and Jackson Phillip, Trinidadian, 40, is factotum, retired Calypsonian. Harry is trying to put together this Robinson Crusoe-themed pantomime to try and bring guests to this guest house, which is otherwise failing. And he attempts to recruit Jackson to be in the show, even though Jackson is like, I don't really want to do this. I'm not an actor. Yes, I was a steel band man, a serious steel band man, as he puts it. But Jackson is not an actor, and he doesn't really want to do this panto. He seems to also understand on some level that as much as Harry is talking about this sort of devised improvisational approach to performance, Jackson seems to be quite aware that there are going to be limits to what they can do, or what he can do specifically, and that Harry will impose those limits at his discretion. It's not clear that Harry thinks of himself this way. He seems to think of himself as quite sort of open-minded and anti-racist and anti-colonialist and things like this. And yet, he does periodically reinforce that he is the boss. He is the owner of this guest house, and Jackson is his employee, in ways that are definitely racially coded and that carry colonialist echoes. This is post-colonial. On Tobago is where this is set. So this is after Trinidad and Tobago have become independent of the British Empire, but they're still in many post-colonial societies in the immediate post-colonial period, 1950s, 60s, whatever it is, there remained British infrastructure, British authorities, and there remained a minority of British people who attempted more or less, to greater or lesser degrees, more or less, to carry on as though the country was still a British colony. So, we have the Robinson Crusoe-themed panto. That's the big thing that they're trying to construct across this play, across Walcott's play. And this is, of course, significant because Robinson Crusoe is one of the great, I say great in terms of importance, not necessarily quality. I recognize that a lot of people like it. I don't care for it. I'm not a real fan of like 17th century writing style for the most part. um, 17th, 18th century, whatever it is, whenever Robinson Crusoe was written. Doesn't matter. Anyway, I'm not a fan of it. That's the long and the short of it. But because this is a story of a white European shipwrecked on an island who then civilizes a native cannibal, right? It is a foundational sort of aesthetic expression of the colonialist mentality. And so there's inherently a component to that in Harry's decision to make that the center of the panto. But he thinks he can do something interesting with it by switching the roles so that Jackson, his black Trinidadian servant, would play Crusoe, and he, Harry, the white British man, would play Friday. As Jackson points out, this may raise quite a number of problems, particularly if Jackson is sort of free to make the kinds of commentary that he wants to make, etc., etc. And this does end up coming up in quite a significant way, because at one point, Jackson is sort of going for it, right? He is taking the logic of this inversion, and he's taking the logic of the Crusoe story to its conclusion. And Harry pulls back and says, whoa, pump the brakes, player. We're not going this direction. And again, this is sort of the thing that Jackson had somewhat intuited. And so we get this bit here with the sort of questions of like, what are audiences willing to accept? And the implication, of course, is what are white British audiences willing to accept? And Harry tries to phrase this in a way that it doesn't seem like he's just doing some racism, but it doesn't quite work out, right? So he says there, but if you take this thing too seriously, we might commit art, which is a kind of crime in this society. I mean, there'd be a lot of things there that people, well, it would make them think too much, and well, we don't want that. We just want a little entertainment. Jackson says, how do you mean, Mr. True? Harry says, well, I mean, if you did the whole thing in reverse. I mean, okay, well, all right. You got this black man. No, all right. You got this man who is black, Robinson Crusoe, and he discovers this island on which there is this white cannibal, all right? Jackson said, yes. That is after he's killed the goat. Harry says, yes, I know. After he's killed the goat and made the hat, the parasol, and all of that. And anyway, he comes across this man called Friday. Jackson says, how do you know I mightn't choose to call him Thursday? Do I have to copy are we improvising? That's an interesting question, because this is, in fact, what Harry had told him to do, was that this panto would be improvised, a kind of devised theater where they would work together and through experiment, through play, etc., would figure out what they were going to put into this and then polish, revise, etc. That's sort of the basis of devised theater, broadly speaking. And that's what Harry has really presented this as. So then Harry says, all right, so it's Thursday. He comes across this naked white cannibal called Thursday, and then look at what would happen. He'd have to this cannibal, who is a Christian, would have to start unlearning his Christianity. He would have to be taught, he'd have to be taught by this African that everything was wrong, and that that what he was doing, for nearly 2,000 years was wrong. That his civilization, his culture, his whatever was horrible, was all wrong, barbarous, And Crusoe would then have to teach him things like, about Africa, his gods, Patumba, and so on, And it would get very, very complicated. And I suppose ultimately it would be very boring. And that's what we have on our and what we'd have on our hands would be a play and not a little pantomime. Jackson says, I'm too ambitious. Harry says, no, the whole thing would have to be reversed. White would become black, you know? Jackson, smiling, says, you see, Mr. True, I don't see anything wrong with that up to now. Harry says, well, I do. It's not the sort of thing I want, and I think you better clean up, and I'm going inside, and when I come back, I'd like this whole place just as it was. I mean, just before everything started. Jackson says, you mean you'd like it returned to its primal state, natural, before Crusoe finds Thursday? But you see, that is not history. That is not the world. Harry says, no, I don't give an Eskimo's fart about the world, Jackson. I just want this little place here cleaned up, and I'd like you to get back to fixing the sun deck. So this passage I find absolutely fascinating, because Jackson quite rightly points out that Harry had told him to improvise, to explore this theme, this idea of Crusoe as black and Friday as white, right? To explore the implications of this. But as soon as Harry recognizes the implications of this, he immediately shuts it down. It's unacceptable. And the thing is, I think, and I could be reading this wrong, and the actor could portray it differently, but I think Harry says this bit in the middle of what I read there about how an African Crusoe would need to teach a white Thursday that Christianity was wrong and barbarous and would need to teach him about whatever African religion that Crusoe followed, whatever it is, etc., etc. I think Harry says this without a thread of introspective recognition, because that is precisely what Robinson Crusoe does to Friday. But when it's done from the perspective of white European Christian to, I don't even know if Friday is African. I don't suspect he is, because if I remember correctly, it is kind of set in the Caribbean. So an indigenous Caribbean person. But it doesn't really matter one way or another. Like, it is perfectly fine and unquestionable by Harry that a white European Christian would impose their religion, culture, beliefs, etc., in a way that erases an indigenous person's culture or an African person's culture, whatever it is. But it's horrific to imagine that being done by an African or an indigenous person or whatever it is to a white European Christian. And I don't think Harry is sort of meant to be self-aware enough that he recognizes the hypocrisy and the insanity of what he's saying. But Jackson clearly does. And actually, we get this bit a little bit later on. In basically the same conversation, Harry says, "You're really making this very difficult, Jackson. Are you hurt? Have I offended you?" Jackson says, "Hurt? No. I didn't expect any less. I'm not hurt. I'm just..." Harry says, "You're just what?" Jackson says, "I'm just ashamed of making a fool of myself. I expected a little respect, that's all." Harry says, "I respect you. Jackson says, "No, it's perfectly all right." It's really quite a heartbreaking scene. But it does reflect this idea that Jackson fully knows what it is that he is encountering in this world that he lives in, right? This world that is still marked by these racial prejudices, by British assumptions of superiority, by colonial antagonisms, even into the post-colonial period, etc., etc. So that's one element of this play that I really, really love. The other is, I think it has one of the best expressions of the post-colonial conundrum that I've ever read. So earlier in the play, Jackson makes this sort of extended speech, broken up only very minimally by Harry. So he says, so they're talking about this pantomime and what's going to go into it. And Jackson sort of calls out the hypocrisy of a religious system that condemns cannibals and yet indulges in the Eucharist, right? Which is, depending on your particular faith tradition, either the literal body and blood of Christ, transubstantiated, or a symbolic body and blood of Christ, which the believer then consumes. So Harry's like, it's pantomime, Jackson. Keep it light. Make them laugh. Jackson says, okay. Then he giggles. For 300 years I served you. 300 years I served you breakfast in my white jacket on a white veranda. Boss Bwana Effendi Bakra Sahib, in that sun that never set on your empire. I was your shadow. I did what you did, boss. Bwana Effendi Bakra Sahib. That was my pantomime. Every movement you made, your shadow copied. He stops giggling. And you smiled at me as a child does smile at his shadow's helpless obedience. Boss Bwana Effendi Bakra Sahib, Mr. Crusoe, now? Harry asks, now? According to the stage directions, Jackson's speech is enacted in a trance-like drone, a zombie. Jackson says, but after a while the child does get frightened of the shadow he made. He say to himself, that is too much obedience. I better had stopped. But the shadow don't stop, no matter if the child stop playing that pantomime, and the shadow does follow the child everywhere. When he praying, the shadow pray too. When he turn around frightened, the shadow turn around too. When he hide under the sheet, the shadow hiding too. He cannot get rid of it no matter what, and that is the power and black magic of the shadow, boss Bwana Effendi Bakra Sahib. Until it is the shadow that starts dominating the child, it is the servant that starts dominating the master. He laughs maniacally like the shadow. And that is the victory of the shadow, boss. And then normally, he says, and that is why all them Pakistani and West Indians in England, all them immigrant Fridays driving you all you so crazy. And they go keep driving you crazy till you go mad. In that sun that never set, they's your shadow and you can't shake them off. So, in this speech, I think we hit three major elements of post-colonial theory really beautifully expressed. So the first is colonial mimicry, which is an idea that originally, I think, comes from Homi Bhabha in his collection, The Location of Culture. He talks about colonial mimicry as sort of the foundation of how colonized subjects behave, right? This sort of idea that colonized subjects are trained to behave in Europeanized ways. And we get this as well in, say, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. We get this in other sort of personal narratives and theoretical analyses of colonial education systems, etc., cultural destruction in colonial societies. But this idea of colonial mimicry is rooted in this sort of sense that colonized subjects take their behavioral cues from those in charge within the colonial system. So that works through the education system, right, where people are taught to speak English or French or Dutch or whatever it is rather than their native languages. People are taught that their own cultural practices are reprehensible, wrong, savage, backwards, whatever bullshit, and they're taught to behave like Europeans. But this also occurs through the sort of socio-cultural disciplining of people, right? You have, in say, Africa, you have African servants working in colonial white serving hotels, bars, clubs, etc., and they are taught, here is how you behave towards white people. And it is, again, this sort of mimicry, right? And what Baba says, or part of what Baba says, is that this is both a strategy, it's a survival strategy, it's a mockery strategy through which the native reflects back to the settler in distorted form the manners, the behaviors, the standards, the requirements, etc., right? There's always just that element of difference that highlights the cultural contingency of European cultures imposed on natives. So we've got that element, right? That element of mimicry is very directly addressed here. But then we've also got this other element to it, and this is really developed by Frantz Fanon in his book Black Skins, White Masks, which is that through this colonial mimicry, native people take on those identities and they become sort of fused, right? The impossibility of separating out, here is me, my authentic cultural self, to the extent that there is a concept of an authentic cultural self. But this is me, this is my culture, who I am, etc., versus this is what has been imposed on me from without. It becomes impossible to separate those two, right? And so that's one element of this. But then the other element of this, the sort of third element of this, really becomes a sort of, is really about sort of, and this is another thing that Homi Bhabha talks about, and among other people, I can't think of the guy's name off the top of my head. I wanted to say Paul is his first name. Maybe not. Gilroy, I think, is his last name. He wrote the books Post-Colonial Melancholia and Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. I want to say Paul Gilroy, but that doesn't sound quite right. I'll try and remember to look it up, though I may forget, and I'll put it in a little text box at the bottom. But one of the things that he's really interested in is how colonialism comes to reflect back into the colonizing society, right? That this is a structure through which the experience of colonization gets imprinted on the colonizing society, particularly when people from the colonies return to the metropolitan center. And so the last bit of Jackson's speech here, where he's talking about Pakistanis, West Indians, I throw in Africans because a lot of people directly from African colonies like Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, etc., also emigrated to Britain during this period. the sort of the return of the colonized subject to the colonial center becomes this massively disorienting force for British people, French people, Dutch people, etc., who are suddenly confronted with the people that they have been colonizing. And it becomes this sort of strange undercutting of the colonialist mindset.